The plane was falling from the sky, and Riley Thornhart was dying. She could taste blood in her mouth, feel it soaking through her shirt where jagged metal had found soft flesh. Around her, the twisted wreckage of Air India Flight 171 groaned and settled into the snow-covered wilderness like a dying beast. The screaming had stopped, whether because there was no one left to scream or because she could no longer hear them over the ringing in her ears, she didn't know. What she did know was that the tiny bundle pressed against her chest was still breathing. Luna. The name had come to her the moment her daughter drew her first breath in this frozen hell, born not in a hospital room with Marcus holding her hand, but in the blood and chaos of a plane crash with death reaching for them both. "Please," Riley whispered to whatever gods might be listening, her voice barely a rasp. "Let her live. Let someone find her." The baby's cry was weak but persistent, a sound so achingly beautiful that Riley felt tears freeze on her cheeks. She didn't have long. She could feel her life seeping away with every heartbeat, but maybe it would be long enough. 12 hours earlier. Riley had been running from her past when the plane took off from Mumbai, but she never imagined she'd be running toward her death. The pregnancy test sat heavy in her carry-on bag like a loaded gun. 2 pink lines that changed everything and nothing all at once. Marcus Blackwood, her former mate, her former everything, had made his choice 6 weeks ago when he stood before their pack and announced his engagement to Brielle Hammond. Perfect Brielle with her beta bloodlines and her ability to give him suitable heirs, without the shame of being bonded to an Omega. The rejection had nearly killed her. Literally. The bond between mates wasn't meant to be severed, and when Marcus had formally rejected her in front of the pack council, every cell in her body had screamed in agony. She'd spent 3 days in the pack hospital, her wolf howling in a grief so deep it seemed to echo in her bones. But she'd survived. And now she was carrying proof that their bond had meant something, even if only to her. "Ma'am, we're beginning our descent into Delhi," the flight attendant said, jolting Riley from her thoughts. "Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened." Riley nodded, adjusting the belt over her still flat stomach. In a few hours, she'd catch her connecting flight to Vancouver where her cousin Emma waited with open arms and no questions asked. A fresh start. A place where being an Omega didn't define her worth. She pressed her hand protectively over her secret and tried not to think about how Marcus would react when he discovered she was gone. Would he care? Would he even notice? The elderly Indian woman beside her was knitting something soft and yellow. "For my newest grandchild," she explained when she caught Riley looking. "My daughter just had a baby girl. They're calling her Priya. It means beloved." Riley's throat tightened. "That's beautiful. Children are such gifts," the woman continued, her needles clicking rhythmically. "No matter how they come to us. No matter how they come to us." Riley wanted to believe that, wanted to think that love would be enough to raise this baby alone. But the fear sat cold in her stomach alongside the morning sickness. What if she couldn't provide everything her child needed? What if Marcus was right and she really was too weak, too broken? She was still wrestling with those dark thoughts when the plane began to shake. At first, it felt like normal turbulence, the kind that made nervous flyers grip their armrests but didn't worry seasoned travelers. But then came the sound that would haunt her dreams forever, a grinding, metallic screech followed by a bang so loud it seemed to split the world in half. The lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow flowers blooming in hell. The plane tilted sharply to the left, and Riley felt her stomach drop as they began to fall. "This is your captain speaking," came the crackling voice over the intercom, barely audible over the wind screaming through what sounded like a breach in the hull. "We've experienced engine failure and are attempting an emergency landing. Please assume the brace position, Anne." The announcement cut off in a burst of static. People were screaming now, praying in a dozen different languages. The elderly woman beside Riley clutched her knitting needles like rosary beads, her lips moving in silent prayer. Across the aisle, a businessman was crying into his phone, trying to tell someone he loved them over the chaos. Riley pulled the oxygen mask over her face with shaking hands and pressed both palms to her stomach. "Hold on, baby," she whispered. Hold on. The plane lurched again, spinning now as well as falling. Through her window, she could see nothing but white, snow and clouds and the endless Canadian wilderness rushing up to meet them. In that moment, she understood with crystal clarity that they weren't going to make it to any airport. They were going to crash. The first contraction hit her just as the plane began to break apart. Pain ripped through her abdomen, different from the terror, sharper and more urgent. No, not now. It was too early. She was only 6 weeks along. This couldn't be happening. But her body didn't care about timing or possibility. Another contraction followed, and another, each one stealing her breath even as the plane continued its deadly descent. Help, she gasped, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The woman beside her was unconscious now, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. The businessman across the aisle wasn't moving at all. The plane hit the ground with the force of a meteor. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. Seats tore loose from their moorings and became projectiles. Riley felt something sharp slice across her ribs, felt the warmth of blood spreading across her skin. But through it all, she kept her arms wrapped around her middle, protecting the impossible life growing there. When the plane finally stopped moving, the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Riley tried to move and gasped as pain shot through her left leg. Broken, probably. Around her, the cabin was a twisted nightmare of metal and shadows. Most of the other passengers were still, too still, their bodies bent at angles that spoke of finality. Another contraction gripped her, and this time she felt something wet and warm between her legs. Not blood, something else. Her water breaking. No, she whimpered, but her body had already made the decision. This baby was coming whether she was ready or not, whether it was safe or not. She was alone in the wreckage, giving birth to a child who might not survive the night. But as another contraction built, stronger than the last, Riley Thornhart made a choice. She might be broken, bleeding, and dying in the middle of nowhere, but she would bring this baby into the world. She would love it for however long she had left. She would not let Marcus's rejection define the end of her story. The next contraction brought her daughter into the world with a cry that cut through the silence like a blade of pure life. Chapter 2. It was a truth as fundamental as breathing, as inevitable as the moon rising each night to call to the beast that lived beneath his skin. For 34 years, Alpha Axel had ruled the Northern Territories with an iron fist and claws that had never failed to find their mark. Even his own pack, hardened warriors who had fought beside him for decades, still stepped carefully in his presence, still felt their wolves whimper when his eyes went cold. Today, he had been hunting elk in the deep wilderness, leading a small group of his most trusted betas through the snow-laden forests that marked the edge of his domain. It was a ritual that kept his legion satisfied, kept the predator in him from turning its attention to less appropriate prey. The political games of pack alliances and territorial disputes were necessary evils, but they didn't feed the savage hunger that lived in his chest. The hunt did. He was crouched low beside the tracks of a massive bull elk, reading the story the snow told him, when the scent hit him like a physical blow. Moonflowers. Sweet and haunting, the kind of scent that belonged to dreams and half-remembered fairy tales. But underneath it, desperation so sharp it made his teeth ache, and something else. Something that made every instinct he possessed suddenly snap to attention. Omega. But not just any Omega. This sense sang to something primal in him, something that had been sleeping for so long he'd thought it was dead. His legion threw back its head and howled inside his mind, a sound of such pure, possessive hunger that Axel had to dig his claws into the frozen earth to keep from shifting on the spot. Alpha? His beta, Logan Mercer, approached cautiously. Marcus had served him for 15 years and knew better than most how quickly Axel's mood could turn deadly. You've gone still as death. What is it? Axel's nostrils flared as he lifted his head, following the scent like a bloodhound. It was coming from the north, maybe 5 miles away. And there was something wrong with it, pain and blood and the copper tang of death mixing with that intoxicating moonflower sweetness. Something's happened, he said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. Something that requires our immediate attention. He was already moving, his long legs eating up the distance with inhuman speed. Behind him, he could hear the rest of his hunting party scrambling to keep up, but he didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. Whatever was calling to him was in trouble, and every second they delayed felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The scent grew stronger as they ran, and with it came other smells that made his beast snarl with rage. Jet fuel. Burning electronics. The metallic reek of twisted metal and death. A plane crash. They crested a ridge and there it was, a scar of devastation carved into the pristine wilderness like a wound. The aircraft had carved a path through the trees before coming to rest in a small clearing, its body broken and smoking. Even from this distance, Axel could smell the death that clung to the wreckage. But underneath it all, that moonflower scent still called to him. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed behind him. There's no way anyone survived that. Axel was already sprinting down the slope, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he didn't recognize. His Leakin was clawing at his control, demanding to be released, demanding to find the source of that scent and claim it before death could steal it away. The main cabin was a twisted maze of metal and debris. Most of the passengers were clearly beyond help, their sense already fading into the stillness that came after life. But there, in what had once been the middle section of the plane, that moonflower scent bloomed stronger. Axel followed it like a man possessed, tearing through debris with his bare hands, his enhanced strength making quick work of obstacles that would have stopped a human. And then he saw her. She was crumpled against a partially collapsed seat, her dark hair matted with blood, her clothes torn and stained. But it was the bundle pressed against her chest that made his world tilt on its axis. A baby. Not just any baby, but a newborn so fresh that the scent of birth still clung to them both. The tiny thing was crying, weak, mewling sounds that spoke of cold and hunger and the desperate need for warmth. And the woman holding her. Axel dropped to his knees beside them, his hands hovering over the woman's face as he tried to process what he was seeing. She was beautiful in the way that wild things were beautiful, all sharp angles and fierce defiance even in unconsciousness. But more than that, she was his. Every instinct he possessed was screaming it. His Leakin was pacing behind his ribs like a caged animal, throwing itself against his control with a violence that left him breathless. The scent of her, moonflowers and omega and something uniquely hers, was like a drug he'd never known he was addicted to. Mine, his beast snarled. Mine, mine, mine. Alpha? Marcus had caught up, and his voice was carefully neutral in the way that meant he was trying very hard not to provoke anything. Is she alive? Axel managed, his voice coming out as barely more than a growl. He could see the faint flutter of her pulse at her throat, could hear the shallow whisper of her breathing. But she was fading, blood loss and shock and cold working together to steal her away from him. He would not allow it. With infinite care, he slipped his arms beneath her and the baby, lifting them both against his chest. The moment she was pressed against him, something inside his chest seemed to settle into place, like a lock finding its key. The baby's cries quieted to soft whimpers, as if even in her newborn state she could sense safety. You need to step back, he told Marcus without looking at him. His voice had gone deadly quiet, the tone that preceded violence. Axel, Marcus said carefully, you need to think about this. She's clearly been with another alpha, that baby proves it. The political implications alone. I said step back. The words came out as a snarl that made Marcus's wolf whimper in submission. Even the other betas who had caught up to them took several instinctive steps backward, their survival instinct screaming at them to give their alpha space. Because Axel's eyes had gone pure silver, the color they only turned when his Leakin was riding him hard. And right now, his beast was very close to the surface, very close to deciding that anyone who came between him and the unconscious Omega in his arms was a threat that needed to be eliminated. She's mine, he said simply, and the words carried the weight of absolute law. They're both mine. He could smell the fear on his betas now, sharp and acrid in the cold air. Good. They should be afraid. They had no idea what he was capable of when something truly belonged to him. But Alpha, one of the younger betas ventured, her scent, she belongs to another pack. Another Alpha. Taking her could start a war. Axel's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Let them try. The baby stirred against his chest, and he looked down to see eyes the color of storm clouds looking up at him with a focus that seemed impossible for something so new to the world. She wasn't crying anymore, just studying him with an intensity that made his heart do something strange in his chest. "Hello, little moon," he murmured, his voice gone soft in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew him. "I'm going to take care of you now." The woman, his Omega, his mind insisted with fierce possessiveness, made a small sound of distress. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of deep forest shadow. For a moment, she just stared at him in confusion, as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. "My baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is my baby safe?" Axel said immediately. "She's safe. You both are." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because the tension in her body eased fractionally. Her eyes drifted closed again, but not before he saw something that made his beast roar with rage. Fear. She was afraid of him. Not surprising, given what he was, but it still made him want to find whoever had put that fear in her eyes and tear them apart with his bare hands. He could smell another alpha on her, faded now, but still there. The scent of rejection and abandonment clung to her like smoke. Someone had thrown her away. Some fool had looked at this perfect creature and decided she wasn't worth keeping. Their loss. His gain. "Marcus," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Clear the fastest route back to the fortress. I want the pack doctor ready and waiting when we arrive. Axel, you need to consider." "I need to consider nothing." His voice cracked like a whip across the clearing. "She's injured and the baby needs immediate medical attention. Everything else is secondary." He was already moving, carrying his precious cargo with the kind of care usually reserved for priceless artifacts. The woman was so small in his arms, so fragile. It awakened every protective instinct he possessed, and some he hadn't known existed. As they made their way through the snow toward home, Axel's mind was already racing ahead, planning and strategizing. There would be questions, certainly. Political ramifications that would ripple through pack society like stones thrown into still water. Other alphas who would see his claim as either an opportunity or a threat. He didn't care. He'd spent his entire adult life being what others needed him to be, the ruthless alpha king who kept the peace through strength and fear. He'd given up any hope of finding his true mate decades ago, had accepted that his destiny was to rule alone until the day he died. But now everything had changed. The Omega in his arms was his. The baby pressed against his chest was his. And he would burn the world down before he let anyone take them from him. "Home," he murmured against the woman's hair, breathing in that intoxicating moonflower scent. "I'm taking you home." Behind him, his betas followed in silence, understanding on some primal level that their alpha had just claimed something worth killing for. The balance of power in the northern territories had just shifted, though none of them could have predicted how dramatically. As they disappeared into the forest, the wreckage of Flight 171 smoldered behind them like a funeral pyre for the life Riley Thornhart had been running from. She would never have to run again. Wanting to see what would happen next, subscribe to this channel to get to listen to more of our upcoming exciting stories. Click on the subscribe button now. Thank you. Chapter 3. The Nightfall Fortress rose from the mountainside like something carved from nightmares and ancient stone. Even unconscious, Riley seemed to sense its oppressive presence. Her breathing grew more labored as they approached the massive gates, and the baby in Axel's arms began to fuss with increasing urgency. "Easy," he murmured against Riley's temple, his voice pitched low and soothing. But there was nothing gentle about the way his arms tightened around them both, nothing soft about the predatory satisfaction that gleamed in his silver eyes as he carried his prizes through the entrance to his domain. The pack members who had gathered in the courtyard took one look at their alpha's face and melted away like mist. Word had already spread, Axel Grayson had claimed something, and everyone with half a brain knew better than to get in his way when he was in full possession mode. Dr. May Whitlock was waiting in the tower's highest room, her medical supplies already laid out with military precision. She was one of the few people who could speak freely to Axel, a privilege earned through decades of stitching him back together after battles and keeping his secrets when lesser wolves would have buckled under the weight of them. On the bed, she commanded without preamble, her dark eyes taking in the blood-soaked state of her new patients. "And step back so I can work." Axel's jaw clenched. "I'm not leaving." "I didn't say leave. I said step back." Elena's tone brooked no argument. "Unless you want your hovering to interfere with their care." For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. His beast was riding him hard, every instinct screaming at him to maintain physical contact with what belonged to him. But then the baby's cries grew weaker, more distressed, and something in his chest twisted painfully. He placed them on the bed with infinite care, but retreated only far enough that Elena could work. His eyes never left them, tracking every breath, every flutter of movement as if his vigilance alone could keep death at bay. "Christ," Elena breathed as she began her examination. "What happened to her?" "Plane crash," Axel said shortly. "She gave birth in the wreckage." Elena's hands stilled for a moment. "This baby is barely hours old, and she's been through trauma that would kill most adults." She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much death to harbor many illusions. "The miracle isn't that they survived, it's that they're both still fighting." She worked in efficient silence for several minutes, cleaning wounds and checking vitals. The baby, Luna, his mind whispered possessively, was surprisingly strong for something so small. Her lungs were clear, her reflexes good. A fighter, like her mother. But when Elena turned her attention to Riley, her expression grew troubled. "Axel," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. What exactly do you know about this woman?" "What I need to know." His tone warned against pressing, but Elena had never been one to back down from a challenge. "Look at her shoulder," she said, pulling back the blood-stained fabric to reveal a mark that made Axel's beast roar with rage. It was a rejection scar, the kind that formed when an alpha formally severed a mating bond. But this wasn't clean or properly healed. The edges were ragged and infected, the skin around it mottled with an unnatural pallor. "This is weeks old," Elena continued, her voice carefully neutral. "And it was done wrong. Deliberately wrong. Someone wanted this to hurt as much as possible." Axel's claws extended involuntarily, puncturing the stone floor where his hands were braced. "Explain." "When an alpha rejects a mate properly, there's usually some attempt to minimize the psychological damage. This." She gestured to the festering wound. "This was meant to break her. And it nearly worked." Elena's examination grew more thorough, and with each discovery, Axel's fury grew. Evidence of systematic cruelty written across Riley's skin, old bruises that spoke of rough handling, stress marks that indicated chronic fear, and underlying it all, the spiritual damage that came from being thrown away by someone who was supposed to protect her. "Her wolf is barely there," Elena said finally, sitting back on her heels. "I can sense it, but it's diminished. Traumatized. The rejection was bad enough, but carrying and delivering that baby in her condition should have killed her. But it didn't." Axel's voice was deadly quiet. "No. Which means she's stronger than whoever hurt her gave her credit for." Elena's eyes found his, and in them he saw a warning. "But she's also more fragile than she appears. This kind of damage doesn't heal quickly, and it doesn't heal without the right kind of care." "The right kind of care." The words echoed in Axel's mind as Elena finished her work and left him alone with his sleeping treasures. What did he know about caring for anything beyond the brutal requirements of leadership? His world was built on strength and dominance, on the understanding that only the powerful survived. But looking at Riley's too pale face and the way she unconsciously curled herself around the baby even in sleep, something shifted in his chest. She was his now, marked by his protection if not yet by his claim. And what belonged to Axel Grayson was maintained in perfect condition. He would heal her because perfection was the only acceptable state for his possessions. The thought should have disturbed him. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Riley woke to the sound of a crackling fire and the scent of cedar and winter storms. For a moment, she lay still, trying to process what she was experiencing. Soft sheets instead of twisted metal. Warmth instead of bitter cold. The gentle weight of a baby sleeping on her chest instead of the crushing certainty that they were both going to die. Luna. Her daughter was alive. She sat up carefully, her body protesting every movement. They were in a tower room with windows that looked out over an endless expanse of wilderness. The furnishings were expensive but austere, everything built for function rather than comfort. It felt like a fortress. Or a prison. "You're awake." The voice came from the shadows near the fireplace, and Riley's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice, had heard the stories whispered around pack fires and in the safety of locked rooms. Axel Grayson. The Alpha King whose territory stretched across the northern reaches like a sprawling empire. Whose justice was swift and brutal and absolute. Whose interest in anything was usually a death sentence. He stepped into the light, and Riley felt her breath catch. He was everything the stories claimed and more, tall enough to dwarf most men, with shoulders that spoke of violence and strength. His hair was dark as winter nights, his eyes the color of fresh steel. But it was the way he moved that truly frightened her, like a predator that had never learned to doubt its own supremacy. "Where are we?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Safe." He approached the bed with careful steps, and she noticed he kept his hands visible, as if he understood that his very presence was a threat. "My fortress. My territory. No one can hurt you here." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like shackles closing around her wrists. "I need to leave," she said, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "I have a cousin in Vancouver. She's expecting me." Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You're in no condition to travel. Neither is the baby." "Luna. Her name is Luna." The correction slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted drawing his attention to her daughter. "Luna," he repeated, and the way he said it, like he was tasting something precious, made her skin crawl. A beautiful name for a beautiful child. "Thank you for helping us," Riley said carefully, "but we really should go. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden." His tone was final, absolute. "You're under my protection now." The word protection sounded more like possession the way he said it, and Riley felt panic begin to claw at her throat. She'd just escaped one alpha who treated her like property. She wouldn't, let herself fall into the same trap again. "I appreciate that, but you're not leaving." The words hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and unmistakable. Riley stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. "I'm sorry." "You heard me." He moved closer to the bed, and every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. "You're weak, injured, and caring for a newborn. Leaving would be suicide. That's my choice to make." "No," he said simply. "It's not." The casual certainty in his voice was more terrifying than any threat could have been. This wasn't a man who made idle statements or engaged in pointless arguments. When Axel Grayson said something, it became reality through sheer force of will. "You can't keep me here," she said, but even to her own ears the protest sounded weak. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Can't I?" Luna stirred against her chest, making soft mewling sounds that meant she was hungry. Riley looked down at her daughter, so small, so helpless, and felt the fight drain out of her. What choice did she have? She was weak as a kitten, had no money, no resources, no pack to call for help. And Luna needed stability, needed care that Riley couldn't provide on her own. At least not yet. "The baby's father," Axel said, settling into a chair that gave him a perfect view of the bed. "Tell me about him." Riley's blood turned to ice. She could smell his suspicion, could see the predatory focus in his eyes as he waited for her answer. If he knew about Marcus, knew that she was carrying another Alpha's child. He was human, she lied, keeping her eyes fixed on Luna's sleeping face. A mistake. He's not in the picture anymore. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. When she finally risked a glance at his face, what she saw there made her stomach clench with fear. He knew she was lying. "Human," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes." "Interesting." He leaned back in his chair, but there was nothing relaxed about his posture. "Because that baby smells like pack. Like alpha bloodlines." Riley's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" His head tilted slightly, and in that gesture she saw the predator beneath the civilized veneer. "You're lying to me, little Omega. And we both know it." Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Axel's expression shifted to one of barely controlled violence. "Enter," he called, his voice carrying a warning that whoever was interrupting had better have a good reason. Logan Mercer stepped into the room, his face carefully blank. "Alpha. We need to talk." "We're talking now." Axel didn't take his eyes off Riley, and she felt pinned beneath his gaze like a butterfly under glass. "Privately," Marcus said, and something in his tone made Axel's attention snap to him. "5 minutes," Axel said to Riley, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Then we finish our conversation." The promise in his words made her blood run cold. As the two men stepped into the hallway, she caught fragments of their hushed conversation, words like political suicide and war and another alpha's mate. When Axel returned, his face was a mask of cold fury. "My beta is concerned," he said, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "He thinks harboring another alpha's rejected mate could cause problems. Start wars." Riley's mouth went dry. "I don't know what." "Let them come." His voice cut through her denial like a blade. "I'll paint the territory with their blood before I give up what's mine." The casual violence in his tone, the absolute certainty that he would kill anyone who tried to take her from him, should have terrified her. Instead, some treacherous part of her, the part that had been thrown away and discarded, felt a dark thrill at being claimed so completely. She buried that feeling deep and focused on the reality of her situation. She was trapped in a tower with a man who saw her as property, who had just declared his willingness to start a war rather than let her go. Marcus had thrown her away, but Axel Grayson had caged her. She wasn't sure which was worse. "Rest," Axel commanded, moving back to his chair by the fire. "You'll need your strength." "For what?" His smile was as sharp as winter. "For everything that comes next." As Riley settled back against the pillows with Luna in her arms, she realized with growing horror that her ordeal was far from over. She'd escaped one possessive alpha only to fall into the hands of another, one whose reputation for brutality made Marcus look like a saint in comparison. But she was alive. Luna was alive. And as long as they both drew breath, there was hope. Even if that hope felt as fragile as moonlight on snow. Chapter 4. 3 days later, the scent of approaching wolves drifted through the fortress like smoke from a funeral pyre. Axel felt it first, his beast lifting its head from where it had been contentedly watching over his sleeping treasures, nostrils flaring as familiar scents invaded his territory. The audacity of it sent a wave of black rage through his system so intense that the windows in the tower room actually cracked from the pressure of his barely contained power. Someone was crossing his borders without permission. Someone with a death wish. He rose from his chair by the fire, where he'd maintained his vigil for the past 72 hours. Riley stirred on the bed, her Omega instincts picking up on his agitation even in sleep. Luna, nestled in a basket beside her mother, made soft whimpering sounds that tugged at something primal in his chest. "Stay here," he murmured, though he knew Riley couldn't hear him. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." The command was unnecessary. She was still too weak to do much more than nurse the baby and sleep, but his beast demanded the reassurance of knowing his mate was safely contained while he dealt with whatever threat was foolish enough to challenge him on his own ground. Logan Mercer was waiting for him in the main hall, his face grim with the kind of tension that preceded bloodshed. "Alpha," he said without preamble, "we have a problem." "How many?" Axel's voice was deadly calm, the tone that had preceded the deaths of more alphas than anyone cared to count. 12. Maybe 15. They're flying the Blackwood pack colors. Blackwood. The name hit Axel like a physical blow, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving suddenly clicking into place. Riley's scent, that moonflower sweetness that had called to his beast from the moment he'd found her. He'd known it was familiar, had felt recognition stirring in the deepest parts of his memory. Because he'd smelled it before, years ago, during a pack gathering where a young Omega had briefly caught his attention before disappearing into the crowd. He'd thought about her afterward, wondered who she belonged to, but other matters had taken precedence. Riley Thornhart. His mind supplied the name with crystalline clarity, along with memories of rumors and whispered gossip about Marcus Blackwood's treatment of his Omega mate. "Send word," Axel said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "They have permission to approach under flag of truce. But only their alpha. The rest stay at the border." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, the careful setup, the controlled environment, smacked of negotiation rather than the immediate violence their alpha was known for. But one look at Axel's face killed any protests before they could form. "Yes, alpha." Axel watched his beta leave, then turned his attention to the preparations that needed to be made. Because this wasn't just about territorial disputes or pack politics anymore. This was about the fact that Marcus Blackwood, the fool who had thrown away the most perfect Omega Axel had ever seen, had the audacity to show up on his doorstep making demands. The fool was about to learn why Axel Grayson was called the Beast King. Marcus Blackwood arrived an hour later, and Axel had to give him credit for courage if not intelligence. It took balls to walk into the Nightfall Fortress knowing what waited inside. Or maybe it was just desperation wearing the mask of bravery. He was younger than Axel had expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of pretty boy features that probably made Omega females flutter. But there was weakness in the line of his shoulders, something soft around his eyes that spoke of a man who had never been tested by real adversity. The kind of man who would throw away a treasure because he was too weak to recognize its value. Alpha Nightfall. Marcus inclined his head in what might have been respect or might have been mockery. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Blackwood." Axel didn't offer the same courtesy. He remained seated on the chair that served as his informal throne, positioning himself so that Marcus had to crane his neck to meet his eyes. A subtle dominance play, but effective. "You're a long way from home." "Yes, well." Marcus's smile was sharp around the edges. "Recent events required my immediate attention." "Recent events? I believe you have something that belongs to me." The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Axel felt his beast stir, felt claws extending just enough to score the stone armrests of his chair. Around the hall, his pack members shifted restlessly, sensing their alpha's rising fury. "Interesting," Axel said, his voice deceptively mild. "I wasn't aware I had anything of yours." "My former mate." "And my daughter." "Former mate." The casual dismissal in those words made Axel want to rip Marcus's throat out with his bare hands. But he was curious now, wanted to understand exactly what kind of game this fool thought he was playing. "Ah." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of casual indifference. "The Omega from the plane crash. And here I thought she was unclaimed." Marcus's jaw tightened. "A technicality." The rejection was premature. Premature. Axel tasted the word like wine. "How so?" "I didn't know she was carrying my heir when I made my decision." Marcus's mask was starting to slip, revealing the desperation underneath. "If I had known. You would have kept her as a broodmare instead of throwing her away like garbage." Axel's voice could have frozen fire. "How noble of you." "She lied to me," Marcus snapped, his carefully constructed facade cracking completely. "Hid the pregnancy until it was too late to." "To what?" The question came out as a snarl that made every wolf in the hall take a step back. "To murder your unborn child?" Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable. "To make arrangements." The political situation was complicated. "So you put her on a plane?" Axel rose from his chair with liquid grace, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sent you're pregnant, rejected made a way to fend for herself. It seemed like the best solution for everyone involved. Everyone. Axel took a step closer, and Marcus actually stumbled backward. Tell me, Blackwood, did it seem like the best solution when her plane went down? When she was bleeding out in the wreckage, giving birth to your child while certain she was going to die? Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, guilt, maybe, or fear at being found out. That was an accident. Mechanical failure. Was it? The two words carried the weight of absolute certainty, and Marcus went white as fresh snow. Around the hall, the assembled pack members shifted restlessly, sensing blood in the water. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. Axel's smile was all teeth and no warmth. I'm stating facts. You wanted your pregnant Omega gone. Permanently. What better way than a tragic accident over the Canadian wilderness? You're insane. But Marcus's voice shook as he said it, and they both knew the truth was written all over his face. Am I? Axel circled him slowly, like a predator sizing up wounded prey. Tell me, how much did it cost to sabotage that plane? How many innocent people died for your convenience? You can't prove anything. Marcus was sweating now, his composure completely shattered. I don't need to prove anything. Axel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the hall. Because you're going to tell me. All of it. Every sordid detail of how you tried to murder my mate. Marcus's eyes went wide with shock and dawning horror. She's not your mate. She's damaged goods. A used Omega who couldn't even keep her first alpha interested. The words were a mistake. A fatal one. The change in Axel was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was a man having a conversation, the next, he was something else entirely. Something that had clawed its way out of nightmares and taken human form. His eyes went pure silver, his canines extending past his lower lip, and when he smiled, it was with the promise of violence so absolute that Marcus actually whimpered. Damaged goods, Axel repeated, his voice no longer entirely human. Is that what you call the mother of your child? She is what she is. Marcus was backing toward the door now, but Axel's pack had quietly moved to block all the exits. You can't change that by playing protector. Everyone will know what she is, what you are for taking another alpha's cast-offs. Let them. Axel's claws were fully extended now, gleaming like polished steel in the firelight. But first, you're going to answer some questions. I don't have to tell you anything. Oh, but you do. Axel's smile widened, and several of his pack members actually took involuntary steps backward. Because you made a critical error in judgment when you decided to come here. What error? You forgot who you were dealing with. Axel began to shift, bones cracking and reforming as his beast clawed its way to the surface. I'm not some political alpha who plays by gentlemen's rules. I'm the monster parents tell their children about to make them behave. I'm the thing that kills other alphas and decorates my walls with their bones. Marcus was pale as death now, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. You can't touch me. I came under a flag of truce. Which you voided the moment you admitted to attempted murder. Axel's voice was barely recognizable, distorted by fangs and fury. My territory, my rules. And my rule is simple, anyone who threatens what's mine dies screaming. The Pack Council will never stand for. The Pack Council answers to me. Axel was fully shifted now, a creature of nightmare and shadow that stood 8 feet tall and radiated menace like heat from a forge. Just like everyone else. Marcus made a break for the door, but he was too slow, too weak, too human in his desperation. Axel caught him before he'd taken 3 steps, one massive hand closing around his throat and lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Now, Axel said, his voice a rumbling growl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself, let's discuss the terms of your confession. I'll give you anything, Marcus gasped, clawing futilely at the hand crushing his windpipe. Money, territory, political alliances. I don't want your offerings. Axel brought Marcus closer, until they were eye to eye, until Marcus could see his own death reflected in those pitiless silver orbs. I want the truth. All of it. The truth about what? The plane. Axel's grip tightened fractionally, and Marcus made a choking sound. The sabotage. How much you paid to try to kill my maiden child? It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The words tumbled out of Marcus in a desperate rush. It was just supposed to be a malfunction. Engine trouble that would force an emergency landing. I never meant for it to crash. Axel's voice was deceptively gentle. For 147 people to die. For Riley to give birth in twisted metal while believing she was going to die. I didn't know she would go into labor. The stress, the trauma, it wasn't part of the plan. Whose plan? The question cracked like a whip. Mine. Marcus was sobbing now, all pretense of alpha dominance stripped away. It was my plan. My money. My mechanic who sabotaged the engine. And now you want them back. Axel set Marcus down but didn't release his throat. The Omega you tried to murder and the child you tried to kill in the womb. Why? The bloodline. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. Luna carries true Luna genetics. From Riley's grandmother. It makes her valuable. Valuable how? Pack strength. Political power. The true Luna bloodline hasn't been seen in 3 generations. Having her would make my pack dominant in the region. So you tried to kill them, and now you want them back because they're useful to you. Axel's free hand extended claws that gleamed like razors. How very alpha of you. You don't understand the pressures. Oh, but I do. Axel's claws traced delicate patterns on Marcus's cheek, just deep enough to draw blood. I understand that you're a weak, pathetic excuse for an alpha who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as the woman you threw away. You can't keep them. Marcus was desperate now, grasping at straws. The Pack Council, the other alphas, they'll never accept your claim. She's damaged, broken. Keeping her makes you look weak. Axel's laugh was a sound from the depths of hell. Let them come. Let them all come. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any roar. I'll paint my territory with their blood and hang their bones from the fortress walls. And when the last challenger is dead, when the last dissenting voice is silenced, everyone will understand one simple truth. What truth? Axel's smile was sharp as winter, cold as death, and utterly without mercy. That Riley Thornheart belongs to me now. And I keep what's mine. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus's labored breathing sounded like thunder. Around the hall, Axel's pack watched with predatory anticipation, waiting to see if their alpha would finally end this farce or draw it out for his own amusement. But before Axel could decide, another scent drifted into the hall, moonflowers and determination, with an undercurrent of fear that made his beast whimper with the need to comfort and protect. Riley was awake. And she was listening. If you're still listening to this story up to this point, why don't you subscribe to this channel to continue getting impactful daily stories like this? We would be most grateful if you can do that to help boost this video to reach everyone. Thank you. Chapter 5. Riley descended the stone steps of the tower with Luna clutched against her chest, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to hide, to protect her daughter from whatever violence was building in the great hall below. But she couldn't. Not when she'd heard Marcus's voice echoing through the fortress like a poison she'd thought she'd escaped forever. The baby stirred in her arms, making soft sounds of distress that seemed to echo the growing tension in the air itself. The ancient stones of the fortress hummed with something that felt alive, responsive, as if the very walls were awakening to some power Riley didn't understand. She paused at the entrance to the hall, taking in the scene with growing horror and fascination. Marcus looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by both fear and the towering presence of the man who held him. Axel was partially shifted, more beast than man, radiating a violence so absolute that even she, exhausted and weak as she was, could feel it pressing against her skin like a physical weight. You have no legal claim to them, Marcus was saying, his voice high with desperation. Pack law is clear, blood rights supersede all other considerations. Luna is my daughter, carries my bloodline. The Omega is my former mate. I have the right to. You have no rights here. Axel's voice was barely recognizable, distorted by fangs and fury. You forfeited them the moment you tried to murder them. I never tried to. You've already confessed. Axel's claws traced another line down Marcus's face, deeper this time. In front of witnesses. So tell me, what gives you the audacity to demand anything after attempting infanticide? Marcus's eyes darted around the hall, seeking escape or allies and finding neither. When his gaze landed on Riley hovering in the doorway, something ugly and familiar twisted his features. There, he said, pointing at her with his free hand. Ask her. Ask your precious Omega what she did. How she lied and manipulated Anne. Careful, Axel warned, his grip tightening on Marcus's throat. Very careful how you finish that sentence. But Marcus was beyond rational thought now, drowning in desperation and the kind of rage that came from having his failures exposed. She's nothing but a lying whore who got pregnant and then ran away rather than face the consequences of her deception. The words hit Riley like physical blows, each one designed to cut deep. She'd heard them before, or variations of them, whispered behind her back in her former pack, spoken to her face during the worst of Marcus's rages. But hearing them now, in this place, in front of Axel. Luna began to cry, a thin wailing that seemed to pierce through the stone walls and echo strangely in the cavernous space. Around the hall, Axel's pack shifted restlessly, their wolves responding to the infant's distress with confusion and instinctive protectiveness. Look at her, Marcus continued, emboldened by Axel's momentary stillness. Weak, broken, damaged beyond repair. She couldn't even keep her first alpha satisfied. What makes you think she's worth protecting? That was his second mistake. His first had been coming here at all. But when he broke free of Axel's momentarily relaxed grip and lunged toward Riley, grabbing her arm with bruising force and yanking her into the hall, he sealed his fate with the finality of a coffin nail. You're coming home, he snarled, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave marks. You and my daughter. This charade is over, you runaway bitch. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Every light in the fortress went out at once, plunging them into darkness so complete it seemed solid. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a heartbeat, and the ancient stones began to emit a low, thrumming sound that felt like a war drum beaten by giants. But it was the sound that came from Axel that truly chilled the blood, a roar of such primal fury that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It wasn't entirely human, wasn't entirely wolf, but something altogether more primordial and terrifying. When the emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in hellish red shadows, Axel was no longer recognizably the man who had been questioning Marcus moments before. He was something else entirely, a creature of nightmare and legend, standing nearly 9 feet tall with claws like obsidian daggers and eyes that burned with silver fire. Marcus's hand was still on Riley's arm when Axel moved. The beast didn't simply attack, he dismantled. With surgical precision and methodical brutality, he began taking Marcus apart piece by piece, starting with the hand that had dared to touch what belonged to him. The sound of bones breaking echoed through the hall like gunshots. Marcus's scream was cut short as Axel's claws sliced through tendon and muscle, rendering his right arm useless in a matter of seconds. But the beast wasn't finished, wasn't even close to finished. You touched her, Axel's voice rumbled from somewhere deep in his chest, each word dripping with promise of agony. With hands that tried to kill her. With fingers that signed her death warrant. He grabbed Marcus's left shoulder and twisted, the sickening crunch of dislocating joints making several pack members turn away in revulsion. But Marcus was still conscious, still breathing, still able to experience every moment of what was being done to him. You called her a bitch, Axel continued, methodically breaking Marcus's ribs one by one. My mate. The mother of a true Luna. You dared to put your filthy mouth on words that should be worshipping her. Blood poured from Marcus's wounds, pooling on the stone floor in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Around the hall, Axel's pack watched in frozen fascination and terror, understanding on some primal level that they were witnessing something that would be spoken of in whispers for generations. This wasn't just an alpha asserting dominance. This was a force of nature unleashing itself on something that had offended the natural order. But as the violence reached its crescendo, something else was happening, something that made the air itself shimmer with power and possibility. Riley's wolf was stirring. She could feel it deep in her chest, that spark of wildness that Marcus's rejection had nearly extinguished. It was responding to the violence, to Axel's absolute dominance, to the scent of spilled blood and the sound of bones breaking. But more than that, it was responding to Luna. Her daughter had stopped crying, but her little body was warm against Riley's chest, warmer than a newborn should be. And in the emergency lighting, her eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflection. Around them, the fortress itself was responding to whatever was awakening in the baby. Ancient ward stones built into the walls began to pulse with soft phosphorescence, casting patterns of light and shadow that danced across the gore-splattered floor. The very air seemed to thicken with magic, with power that had been sleeping for centuries. "Please," Marcus gasped, his voice barely audible through the blood filling his lungs. "Please, I'll leave. I'll never come back. Just let me." "You'll never leave," Axel said, his voice carrying the finality of Judgment Day. "Because you'll never draw a breath outside these walls again." He grabbed Marcus by the throat, lifting him off the ground with one massive hand. But instead of finishing him quickly, he began to squeeze slowly, gradually cutting off air and blood flow while keeping his victim conscious and aware. "This is what happens," Axel announced to the assembled pack, his voice carrying clearly despite the distortion of his shifted form, "to anyone who threatens what's mine. Remember this. Remember how he dies, and why." Around the hall, heads nodded in understanding and agreement. They had all heard the stories of their alpha's brutality, but seeing it firsthand was something altogether different. This wasn't just violence, it was artistry, carefully calculated and precisely executed to send a message that would echo through pack society for years to come. But as Marcus's life slowly ebbed away, the strange phenomena around the fortress grew stronger. Lights that had been dormant for decades began to flicker to life in unused corridors. Ancient protective runes carved into doorframes started to glow with silver fire. And in the deepest vaults of the mountain, wards that had been set by Axel's ancestors began to sing with renewed power. Luna was the catalyst, her true Luna bloodline awakening systems that had waited generations for the right genetic key. But Riley was the conduit, her wolf spirit finally finding the strength to emerge from the damage Marcus had inflicted on it. She felt it happening, felt something fundamental shifting inside her as she watched Axel defend her with a savagery that should have terrified her but instead awakened every primal instinct she possessed. This was what an alpha was supposed to be. This was what protection looked like when it came from a place of absolute commitment rather than political convenience. Marcus's eyes rolled back as the last of his oxygen was cut off, but Axel wasn't finished with him yet. Even as life left the younger alpha's body, the beast continued his methodical destruction, breaking bones that were already useless, tearing flesh that could no longer feel pain. It was a statement written in blood and violence. This was what happened to anyone who threatened Axel Grayson's mate. When it was finally over, when Marcus's broken body hit the floor with a wet thud that echoed through the suddenly silent hall, Axel remained standing over him for a long moment. Blood dripped from his claws, pooled at his feet, painted the walls in patterns that would stain the stone forever. Slowly, the beast began to recede. Bones cracked and reformed as Axel shifted back to human form, though his eyes remained silver and his canines stayed partially extended. When he finally turned to look at Riley, there was something wild and possessive in his expression that made her breath catch. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, still carrying traces of the beast that had just systematically destroyed a man for daring to touch her. Riley looked down at her arm where Marcus had grabbed her, seeing the finger-shaped bruises already forming on her pale skin. But instead of pain, she felt only a strange sense of completion, as if something that had been broken inside her was finally beginning to heal. "No," she said, and was surprised to find her voice steady. "I'm not hurt." Around them, the fortress continued to pulse with awakening power. Luna had fallen asleep in her arms, but even in slumber the baby seemed to radiate a warmth that had nothing to do with body heat. The ward stones were singing now, a low, harmonic vibration that spoke of protection and power and bloodlines that reached back to the dawn of their kind. Axel approached slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he understood that despite the violence she'd just witnessed, Riley might still be afraid of him. When he reached them, he lifted one blood-stained hand toward her face, then stopped just short of touching her. "He'll never hurt you again," he said simply. "No one will." The promise in his words was absolute, backed by the kind of power that could reshape the world to fit his will. And for the first time since Marcus had rejected her, Riley felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Her wolf was awakening. Luna's power was growing. And the most feared alpha in existence had just painted his halls with blood to protect them both. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally safe. Even if safety came wrapped in chains of possession that might prove impossible to break. Chapter 6. The claiming ceremony took place 3 nights after Marcus's death, when the moon hung full and silver in the star-drunk sky above the Nightfall fortress. Riley stood before the ancient altar in the heart of the mountain, wearing a gown of midnight silk that had belonged to Axel's grandmother, the last Luna to rule these lands before war and tragedy had left him to reign alone. The fabric whispered against her skin like secrets, and the silver threading seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Luna slept peacefully in a cradle carved from moon-blessed oak, positioned where both parents could see her throughout the ritual. The baby had grown stronger in the days since Marcus's death, as if his demise had lifted some invisible weight from her tiny shoulders. Her eyes, when open, now held flecks of silver that matched her new father's, a sign that the bond forming between them was already reshaping her very essence. "You don't have to do this," Dr. May had said earlier, when she'd come to help Riley prepare. "Not if you're not ready. Axel may be many things, but he wouldn't force this on you." Riley had touched the healing marks on her arm where Marcus had grabbed her, then looked across the room to where Axel stood speaking quietly with his beta. Even in conversation, his eyes kept returning to her and Luna, that possessive hunger never quite leaving his expression. "He's already claimed us," she'd replied softly. "This ceremony just makes it official." But that had been a simplification, and they both knew it. What was about to happen in the ancient chamber beneath the fortress was something far more primal than legal documentation or pack politics. This was about binding souls, about marking her so thoroughly that every wolf in existence would know she belonged to the Beast King. The altar itself was carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, covered in runes that predated written history. Around its base, white candles flickered in patterns that had been used for this ritual since the first wolves learned to walk upright under the moon's blessing. Axel approached her with the fluid grace of a predator, wearing ceremonial robes that did nothing to soften his dangerous edge. If anything, the formal attire only emphasized his lethal beauty, the way shadows clung to him like living things, the silver fire that burned behind his eyes. "Last chance to run," he murmured as he took his place beside her, though they both knew she was far too weak to flee even if she'd wanted to. "Where would I go?" The question came out lighter than she'd intended, almost teasing, and something shifted in his expression. "Nowhere," he said simply. "Because you're already home." The pack had gathered in a circle around them, dozens of faces painted silver by moonlight streaming through crystal skylights carved into the mountain itself. These weren't gentle wolves or civilized alphas playing at politics. These were Axel's chosen, hardened by battle and bound to him by loyalty forged in blood and fire. They watched with hungry eyes as their alpha began the ancient words, speaking in the old tongue that resonated through stone and bone alike. Riley couldn't understand the language, but her wolf, now fully awake and restless beneath her skin, recognized the power in those syllables. This was claiming. This was conquest. This was the binding of souls that would reshape the very fabric of who she was. When Axel lifted the ceremonial blade, silver-edged and sharp enough to split moonbeams, Riley felt her breath catch. Not from fear, but from anticipation. Her wolf was practically purring with satisfaction, recognizing this dominance for what it was, protection offered by the strongest predator in existence. "Blood of my blood," Axel said, drawing the blade across his palm without flinching. Dark drops fell onto the altar stone, sizzling where they landed. Bone of my bone. He held out his hand, and Riley placed her palm against the blade without hesitation. The cut was clean and sharp, barely more than a whisper of pain. When their blood mingled on the ancient stone, the entire chamber seemed to pulse with power. Soul of my soul, they said together, the words seeming to come from someplace deeper than memory. The binding hit her like lightning, like drowning, like being reborn in fire and starlight. She felt Axel's presence flood through her, his strength, his darkness, his absolute determination to protect what belonged to him. But more than that, she felt his beast recognizing hers, claiming it, wrapping around her wolf with possessive hunger that left no room for doubt about who she belonged to now. When the silver fire faded from her vision, she found herself pressed against Axel's chest, his arms wrapped around her with steely strength. The pack was howling, a sound of celebration and acknowledgement that echoed through the mountain and out into the night beyond. Mine, he whispered against her ear, and the word carried the weight of absolute law. Forever. She should have felt trapped, should have mourned the loss of her independence. Instead, she felt complete for the first time in her life. This was what a true mating felt like, not the political convenience Marcus had offered, but a binding that reached soul deep and promised protection beyond death itself. Luna stirred in her cradle, making soft sounds that seemed almost approving. When Riley looked down at her daughter, those storm cloud eyes held flecks of silver that definitely hadn't been there before the ceremony. She approves, Axel said, following her gaze. Of course she does, Riley replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. You saved us. Both of us. I kept what was mine. His hand cupped her face with surprising gentleness. I always keep what's mine. The celebration that followed was a feast worthy of kings, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and honey wine, musicians playing melodies that seemed to make the very stones dance. But Riley found herself unable to fully relax into the revelry, some instinct keeping her alert despite the warmth and safety surrounding her. Luna had been fussing all evening, refusing to settle despite being fed and changed. Now she was crying in earnest, not the hungry wails of a newborn, but something else. Something that made the wolves around them shift restlessly and look toward the darkness beyond the feast hall. Something's wrong, Riley said, rising from her chair beside Axel's throne. His nostrils flared, and she saw his beast stir behind his eyes. Rogues. Moving on the perimeter. The attack came like a storm breaking, sudden and violent and overwhelming in its brutality. They poured through the fortress gates like a tide of darkness, rogues and outcasts led by something that made even Axel's pack recoil in recognition. Mordecai the Deathbringer, ancient enemy of the Nightfall line, moved through the chaos with the fluid grace of something that had been killing for centuries. The child, his voice carried over the sounds of battle, somehow reaching every corner of the hall. Give me the true Luna child, and I might let some of you live. Axel was already moving, his form blurring as he shifted into the killing machine that had earned him his reputation. But even as he tore through the rogues with systematic brutality, more kept coming. Too many, too organized, as if they'd been planning this assault for months. Riley found herself pressed against the far wall, Luna clutched protectively against her chest. The baby was screaming now, not with fear, but with something else. Something that made the air itself shimmer with power. Behind you, someone shouted, and Riley spun to see a massive rogue bearing down on her, claws extended and murder in his eyes. She should have died. Should have been torn apart by something easily 3 times her size and weight. Instead, something inside her chest exploded outward like a star going nova. Power. Ancient and terrible and beautiful, flowing through her veins like liquid starlight. Her wolf didn't just emerge, it erupted, wreathed in silver fire that made the emergency lighting look like candle flames. The rogue attacking her simply stopped. Froze mid-lunge as if he'd run into an invisible wall. Around the hall, other rogues began falling to their knees, submission radiating from them in waves so strong they were almost visible. Impossible, Mordecai breathed, his ancient face twisted with something between awe and hunger. You're not just true Luna bloodline. You're the goddess's chosen, Axel finished, his voice carrying a wonder that Riley had never heard from him before. Direct descendant of the original Moon Mother. The power flowing through Riley was intoxicating, terrifying, overwhelming in its scope. She could feel every wolf in the fortress, could sense their pain and fear and desperate loyalty. But more than that, she could feel something deeper, the ancient magic that bound their kind together, the silver threads that connected every pack to the source of their power. And she could control it. "Kneel," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Every rogue in the hall dropped to the ground as if their strings had been cut. Even Mordecai, ancient and powerful as he was, struggled against the compulsion radiating from her. "You want my daughter?" Riley's eyes had gone pure silver, matching Axel's in their otherworldly glow. "You'll have to go through me first." The battle that followed wasn't really a battle at all, it was a demonstration. Riley's power flowed through the fortress like water through a broken dam, washing away resistance and bending wills to her command. But it wasn't brutal or destructive like Axel's strength. It was something else entirely, a maternal force that protected through dominance, that conquered through the absolute certainty of its right to do so. Where his power was darkness and violence, hers was silver light and irresistible command. They complemented each other perfectly, shadow and light, destruction and creation, the beast and the goddess dancing together in perfect, deadly harmony. When the last rogue had either submitted or fled, when Mordecai himself had been forced to retreat rather than face the combined might of the Beast King and his newly awakened mate, the fortress fell silent except for Luna's contented gurgling. The baby had stopped crying the moment Riley's power manifested, as if she'd been waiting for her mother to finally claim her birthright. Now she gazed up at her parents with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her days, the look of something ancient recognizing its own kind. "She knew," Axel said softly, reaching out to touch Luna's tiny hand. "She knew what you were before any of us did." Riley looked around the hall, taking in the faces of the pack members who were now looking at her with something approaching reverence. The power was still there, humming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. But it no longer felt foreign or frightening. It felt like coming home. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Axel's smile was sharp with satisfaction and dark with promise. "Now we rule. Together." He pulled her against him, careful not to disturb Luna, and claimed her mouth in a kiss that tasted like power and possession and something that might have been love if either of them had been brave enough to name it. Around them, the Nightfall pack howled their approval, understanding that their alpha had done more than claim a mate. He'd found his equal, his perfect complement in the ancient dance of dominance and submission that governed their world. The Beast King had his goddess. And together, they would reshape the supernatural world to fit their will. Chapter 7. The attack came again 3 days later, but this time Mordecai didn't bother with stealth or subterfuge. Riley woke to the sound of howling that seemed to come from the very depths of hell, voices twisted by corruption and dark magic until they no longer sounded remotely human. Through the tower windows, she could see them gathering on the mountainside like a plague of shadows, wolves that moved wrong, whose eyes burned with sickly green fire instead of the clean silver of their kind. Luna was crying in her basket, but not the helpless wails of a frightened infant. These were sounds of rage, of power building beyond her tiny body's ability to contain it. The baby's eyes had gone completely silver, and the temperature in the room was dropping with each breath she took. "He's coming," Axel said from beside the window, his voice carrying the deadly calm that preceded violence. "And he's brought friends." Riley could feel them now, the corruption radiating from the approaching army like heat from a forge. It made her skin crawl and her newly awakened power recoil in disgust. Whatever Mordecai had done to those wolves, it was an abomination against everything their kind represented. "How many?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. "Too many to count." His eyes had gone pure silver, his beast already rising to meet the threat. "But numbers won't matter if we can reach their leader." Through the crystal-clear mountain air, Mordecai's voice carried with supernatural clarity, amplified by the dark magic that clung to him like smoke. "Axel Grayson," he called, and even from this distance they could hear the madness threading through his words. "I offer you one final chance. Give me the child and the woman, and I'll make your death quick." Axel's response was a roar that shook the mountain itself, pure predatory fury given voice. Around the fortress, his pack answered with howls of their own, the sound of warriors preparing for battle. But Mordecai wasn't finished with his taunts. Did you truly think this was random? His laughter was like glass breaking in reverse. That fool Marcus was my creature from the beginning. I whispered in his ear about pack politics and bloodline purity, fed his insecurities until rejection seemed like the only option. Riley felt ice settle in her stomach. What is he saying? The plane, Axel said quietly, his hands clenching into fists. Marcus didn't act alone. Oh, but he did act alone, Mordecai continued, his voice carrying impossible distances through the thin air. Right up until he grew greedy. The original plan was simple: reject the Omega, let me take the child after it was born. Clean. Efficient. But Marcus wanted to eliminate them both, claim it was a tragic accident. The fool nearly ruined everything. The revelation hit Riley like a physical blow. Not just Marcus's betrayal, but the knowledge that she'd been manipulated from the beginning. That her entire relationship, her pregnancy, Luna's birth, all of it had been orchestrated by something ancient and evil. The crash was Plan B. Mordecai's voice rose to a shriek of delight. When Marcus bungled the simple task of delivering what belonged to me, I had to improvise. Sabotage the plane, let nature take its course. But even that failed when the Beast King decided to play hero. Around them, the fortress was coming alive with the sounds of preparation. Pack members taking positions, weapons being distributed, the ancient ward stones beginning to pulse with defensive magic. But Riley barely noticed, lost in the implications of what she'd learned. He's been hunting Luna since before she was born, she said, her voice hollow with realization. Not hunting, Axel corrected, his tone deadly. Planning to steal her. To corrupt her power the way he's corrupted everything else he touches. Through the window, they could see Mordecai's army spreading across the mountainside like a cancer. Wolves that had been twisted by dark magic, their forms wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. Some walked on 2 legs when they should have been on 4, others sprouted extra limbs or heads that leered with independent malice. But it was the smell that truly sickened her, corruption so complete it made the air itself feel diseased. They're not just rogues, Riley breathed, horror creeping into her voice. There's something else entirely. Hollowed, Axel said grimly. Their souls carved out and filled with his poison. They're not wolves anymore, just weapons wearing wolf shapes. Luna's cries were reaching a fever pitch now, her tiny body radiating power that made the stones of the fortress hum in harmony. But there was something different about it this time, something that made Riley's maternal instinct scream warnings. The baby wasn't just upset. She was preparing for war. We need to end this, Riley said, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. Before they can get close enough to threaten her. Axel's smile was sharp as winter. Finally. I was wondering when you'd stop playing the victim and start acting like the predator I know you are. The words should have stung, should have made her recoil from the darkness he was offering. Instead, they felt like recognition, like finally being seen for what she truly was beneath the layers of submission and fear that Marcus had wrapped around her. What do you need me to do? Be yourself, he said simply. The goddess your bloodline has been waiting centuries to produce. They descended to the great hall together, Luna secured in a carrier that would keep her close to Riley's heart while leaving her hands free for whatever was coming. The pack had assembled in battle formation, 100 of the most dangerous wolves in existence, all looking to their alpha for guidance. But when Axel took his position before the massive doors that led to the fortress's main entrance, it was Riley who spoke first. Open the gates, she commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that made the ancient stones sing in response. Riley, Axel started to protest, but she cut him off with a look that held all the authority of her awakened heritage. Open them, she repeated. Let him come. Let him bring his corruption and his stolen power and his army of hollow shells. Let him face what he thinks he can steal. Understanding dawned in Axel's eyes, followed by something that might have been pride if he'd been capable of such gentle emotions. You want him close. I want him to see what real power looks like before he dies. The gates opened with the grinding sound of ancient mechanisms awakening. Beyond them, Mordecai's army began to advance, a tide of corruption flowing up the mountain toward the fortress like infected blood seeking a wound. But they weren't running. They weren't charging with the wild fury of berserkers. They were walking, confident in their numbers, certain of their victory. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Mordecai himself led the advance, and Riley got her first clear look at the creature that had orchestrated so much pain and suffering. He might have been handsome once, before the dark magic he'd embraced began eating him from the inside out. Now his skin had a grayish cast, his eyes burned with that sickly green fire, and when he smiled, his teeth were black as old blood. "Axel Grayson," he called out as he approached the fortress entrance. "Still hiding behind your walls like the coward you've always been?" "Not hiding," Axel replied, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Waiting." "For what?" "For you to get close enough that I can tear your throat out with my bare hands." Mordecai's laugh was the sound of grave dirt falling on coffin lids. Bold words from a dead man. "Do you see my army? Do you smell the power I command?" "I smell corruption," Riley said, stepping forward to stand beside Axel. "I smell weakness wearing the mask of strength." The ancient wolf's attention snapped to her, and she felt the full weight of his malevolent focus like ice water in her veins. Ah, the little Omega who thinks she's a goddess. How precious. Not thinks, she corrected, power beginning to build beneath her skin like pressure before a storm. Knows. Luna chose that moment to make her presence known, her baby cries suddenly cutting through the tension like a blade. But these weren't sounds of distress, they were sounds of recognition, of power calling to power across the divide between light and shadow. Mordecai's expression shifted to one of naked hunger. There she is. The true Luna child who will reshape the world once I've carved the weakness out of her. You'll never touch her, Axel snarled, his beast beginning to emerge. Won't I? Mordecai gestured, and his army surged forward like a breaking dam. Kill them all. But bring me the child alive. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an apocalypse. Axel unleashed himself completely, becoming a force of pure destruction that carved through the corrupted wolves like a scythe through wheat. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Riley's power erupted outward in waves of silver fire that burned away corruption wherever it touched. The hollowed wolves didn't just die when her light reached them, they were purified, their stolen souls finally released from the torment Mordecai had inflicted on them. Together, she and Axel were unstoppable. Where his darkness tore and rend, her light healed and cleansed. Where her compassion showed mercy, his brutality ensured no threat would rise again. They moved through the chaos like dancers performing a routine they'd practiced for centuries, complementing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. And with every corrupted wolf that fell, Luna's power grew stronger, her cries of rage becoming something that resonated in the bones of every creature on the mountainside. But Mordecai was ancient, powerful, and far more cunning than his army of puppets. While Axel and Riley carved through his forces, he circled around toward the fortress itself, seeking to bypass them entirely and reach Luna directly. He might have succeeded if Riley hadn't felt his approach through the connection she shared with her daughter. Behind us, she called out, spinning away from the corrupted wolf she'd been cleansing to face the new threat. Mordecai stood in the fortress doorway, his form wreathed in shadows that seemed to drink light. In his hands, dark magic crackled like black lightning, and his smile promised suffering beyond imagination. Too late, he said simply, and launched himself toward Luna's carrier. He never made it. Axel materialized between them like a force of nature given form, catching Mordecai mid-leap and driving him to the ground with bone-crushing impact. The ancient wolf was strong, empowered by centuries of stolen magic and corrupted power. But Axel was stronger. You want to hurt my daughter, he snarled, his claws sinking deep into Mordecai's shoulders. You want to steal from my mate? Your mate? Mordecai laughed even as blood poured from his wounds. She'll never truly be yours. Too much light, too much compassion. She'll never understand what real power requires. Want to bet? Riley's voice came from directly beside them, and when Mordecai turned to look at her, he saw something that made his ancient blood turn to ice. Her eyes had gone completely silver, but there was nothing gentle or compassionate in them now. There was only the cold fury of a mother protecting her young, tempered by the darkness she'd learned from watching Axel rule. "You orchestrated my suffering," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the mountain itself tremble. "You manipulated my mate. You tried to steal my child." She knelt beside where Axel held Mordecai pinned, and placed one delicate hand on the ancient wolf's forehead. "Let me show you what real power looks like." The silver fire that erupted from her touch was nothing like the gentle cleansing light she'd used on the corrupted army. This was something else entirely, purification carried to its logical extreme, burning away not just corruption but everything that had allowed that corruption to take root. Mordecai's screams echoed across the mountainside as centuries of stolen power were ripped away from him, as the dark magic that had sustained his unnatural existence was consumed by Riley's silver flames. But she didn't stop there. "You want to see weakness?" she asked, her voice carrying the terrible certainty of divine judgment. "Look in a mirror." When the flames finally died, what remained wasn't even recognizably wolf anymore. Mordecai had been reduced to something small and pathetic, a creature stripped of power, of corruption, of everything that had made him dangerous. But Riley wasn't finished with him. "Axel," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of love that could reshape worlds. "Would you like to finish this?" The smile that spread across Axel's face was sharp as winter and twice as cold. "With pleasure." What he did to Mordecai next wasn't quick or clean or merciful. It was methodical, brutal, and deeply personal, the kind of violence that spoke to every predatory instinct their kind possessed. And through it all, Riley watched with dark satisfaction, her maternal fury finally given the outlet it deserved. When it was over, when Mordecai's broken form finally stopped twitching, she felt no guilt or remorse. Only the deep satisfaction that came from protecting her family by any means necessary. Luna had stopped crying, her silver eyes now focused on her parents with something that looked remarkably like approval. "It's finished," Axel said, rising from the remains of their enemy. "No," Riley corrected, her voice carrying new certainty. "It's just beginning." She looked out over the fortress, over the territory that was now truly theirs, and felt the future spreading before them like an unwritten book. There would be other challenges, other enemies, other threats to face. But they would face them together, the Beast King and his goddess, darkness and light united in purpose and power. And anyone foolish enough to threaten their family would learn what true monsters looked like when they were finally unleashed. Chapter 8. 6 months after Mordecai's death, the supernatural world had learned to whisper their names in the darkness. Axel and Riley Nightfall, the Beast King and his Moon Queen, rulers of an empire that stretched from the frozen northern territories to the temperate forests of the south. Packs that had once been proud and independent now bent the knee without question, understanding that defiance meant death and submission meant survival under the protection of the most powerful mated pair in werewolf history. Riley stood on the battlements of the fortress, watching the latest delegation of alphas approach with their heads bowed and tribute laid out in careful display. 3 months ago, these same wolves had called her damaged goods, and whispered that Axel had lost his mind claiming another alpha's cast-off. Now they knelt in the snow and begged for the privilege of serving her. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been built piece by piece, territory by territory, through a combination of strategic brutality and displays of power that left no room for doubt about who truly ruled the northern lands. Axel's reputation had always been fearsome, but together they had become something beyond legend, a force of nature that reshaped the political landscape through sheer will and the kind of violence that made other predators remember why they should fear the dark. The Blackwood Territory representatives, Dr. May announced from behind her, though they both knew Riley had sensed their approach long before they'd crested the ridge. Marcus's former pack. The wolves who had stood by and watched while their alpha rejected and discarded her. Who had whispered and gossiped about her shame, who had failed to protect her when she'd needed it most. Now they came bearing gifts and desperate apologies, led by Brielle Hammond, the beta's daughter who had once seemed so perfect, so worthy of an alpha's attention. "Send them to the throne room," Riley said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had been forged in silver fire and tempered by months of absolute rule. "Let them wait." Elena nodded and disappeared back into the fortress, but not before Riley caught the small smile playing at the corners of the doctor's mouth. Even she, one of the few people who remembered the broken Omega who had been brought here dying and desperate, took satisfaction in seeing how completely the tables had turned. Riley made her way through corridors that now displayed the trophies of their conquests, weapons from defeated enemies, banners from submitted packs, and yes, bones from those foolish enough to challenge them directly. The fortress had been transformed from a stronghold into a palace worthy of an empire, every stone singing with the power of its rulers. She found Axel in the nursery, standing over Luna's crib with the kind of fierce protectiveness that had never softened, even as their daughter had grown from helpless infant to increasingly powerful toddler. At 8 months old, Luna was already showing signs of the heritage she'd inherited, eyes that shifted from storm cloud gray to pure silver depending on her mood, and an uncanny ability to make grown wolves submit with nothing more than a focused stare. "The Blackwood delegation?" he asked without turning around, his enhanced senses having tracked her approach from the moment she'd entered the room. "Waiting in the throne room. Brielle Hammond leads them." Now he did turn, and Riley felt the familiar thrill of power that came from seeing the predatory satisfaction in his eyes. How generous of them to finally pay their respects. Luna gurgled from her crib, reaching up toward her parents with chubby hands that already showed the promise of claws. When Axel lifted her, she settled against his chest with the confidence of a child who had never known anything but absolute safety and unlimited power. "What are you thinking?" Riley asked, recognizing the particular quality of stillness that meant her mate was planning something. "That it's time for your coronation." His smile was sharp as winter. "Past time, really. The packs need to understand exactly who they're dealing with." The coronation had been discussed for months, but they'd been building their empire first, establishing the kind of unshakable foundation that would support a formal declaration of sovereignty. Now, with territory stretching across half the continent and every neighboring pack either submitted or destroyed, the time had come to make their rule official. "Tonight?" she asked, though she could already feel the rightness of it settling in her bones. "Tonight. Under the blood moon." He handed Luna to her, and their daughter immediately began playing with the silver pendant that hung around Riley's neck, a gift from Axel that pulsed with protective magic. Let the Blackwood wolves witness what their former packmate has become. The throne room had been transformed for the occasion, ancient banners hanging from the vaulted ceiling and torches casting dancing shadows on walls lined with representatives from every pack in their territory. At the center of it all, 2 thrones carved from midnight stone and inlaid with silver, symbols of power that had been waiting centuries for the right rulers to claim them. The Blackwood delegation knelt with the rest, but Riley could smell their particular cocktail of terror and regret from across the room. Brielle Hammond's face was pale as moonlight, her perfect composure cracked by the reality of facing the woman she'd helped destroy. "Rise," Axel commanded, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Witness the coronation of your queen." The ceremony that followed was older than written history, spoken in the ancient tongue that resonated through stone and bone alike. But this wasn't the gentle investiture of fairy tales. This was the claiming of power by right of conquest, the formal recognition of strength that brooked no challenge. When Axel placed the crown on Riley's head, a circlet of silver and obsidian that had been worn by the first Moon Queens millennia ago, the very air seemed to shimmer with power. But it was when she spoke that the true magnitude of what they were witnessing became clear. "I am Riley Nightfall." Her voice carried harmonics that made the assembled wolves' bones resonate in harmony. "Moon Queen of the Northern Empire, chosen of the goddess, mother of the true Luna bloodline." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the kneeling forms until it landed on the Blackwood delegation. "Some of you knew me once by another name. Knew me as something weak and disposable, something to be discarded when it became inconvenient." Her smile was sharp as her mate's, but somehow more terrifying for its perfect serenity. "That creature is dead. She died in fire and blood and the screams of her enemies. What stands before you now is something altogether different." Brielle Hammond was trembling now, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just political theater, this was a reckoning. "You threw me away," Riley continued, her voice never rising above conversational tones but somehow filling every space in the hall. "Cast me out like garbage when my mate decided I wasn't worthy of his name. And I am grateful." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp with meanings that cut deeper than any physical wound. Because if you hadn't broken me so completely, I never would have found my true strength. If Marcus hadn't rejected me, I never would have discovered what real power felt like. If you hadn't abandoned me when I needed you most, I never would have learned that mercy is a luxury only the strong can afford. She rose from her throne, Luna cradled in her arms, and began to walk down the steps toward the kneeling delegation. With each step, her power grew more visible, silver light that seemed to emanate from her very pores, making her appear almost ethereal in its intensity. "So thank you," she said, stopping directly in front of Brielle Hammond. "Thank you for teaching me that kindness without strength is worthless. That compassion without power is just another word for victim." She knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with the woman who had once seemed so perfect, so untouchable. "Tell me, Brielle," she said softly, "do you still think you made the right choice?" Brielle's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Around her, the other Blackwood wolves pressed their faces to the floor, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be spoken of for generations. "I thought not." Riley rose gracefully, turning her attention to the rest of the assembled packs. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. The weak are consumed by the strong. The hesitant are destroyed by the decisive. And those who mistake mercy for weakness learn the difference when it's far too late to matter." She returned to her throne, settling beside Axel with the fluid grace of someone born to rule. Luna gurgled happily in her arms, seemingly oblivious to the fear radiating from every wolf in the hall. "Your tribute is accepted," Axel announced, his voice carrying the finality of absolute judgment. "Your submission is noted. You may go." The Blackwood delegation fled like their tails were on fire, followed by most of the other pack representatives. Only the core members of their own pack remained, along with the most trusted allies who had proven their loyalty through blood and battle. "Well," Dr. May said dryly from her position near the door, "I think that went well." Riley laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow managed to carry an undertone of menace. "I thought so. Though I suspect the Blackwood pack will be having nightmares for months." "Good," Axel said with satisfaction. "Fear is the most honest emotion. It doesn't lie or flatter or seek advantage. It simply acknowledges reality." As the evening wound down and the last of their guests departed, Riley found herself alone with Axel and Luna in their private chambers. The baby had finally fallen asleep, worn out by the excitement of the day, and lay peacefully in her enchanted cradle while her parents watched over her. "There's something else," Riley said, her hand drifting unconsciously to her stomach. Axel's attention sharpened immediately, his enhanced senses picking up on changes she probably hadn't even noticed herself yet. "How long have you known?" "I suspected a few weeks ago. Elena confirmed it this morning." She smiled, and for a moment the ruthless queen was replaced by something softer, warmer. "Another daughter, she thinks. Due in late spring." The transformation in Axel's expression was instantaneous and profound. The Beast King disappeared, replaced by a mate and father who would burn the world down to protect his family. He pulled her against him with careful strength, mindful of the precious life growing within her. "Another true Luna," he murmured against her hair. "Another heir to the throne we've built." "Built in blood and terror," she added, but there was no regret in her voice. Only satisfaction. "The best kind of foundation," he agreed. "Unshakable." They stood together in the moonlight streaming through their windows, looking out over the empire they had carved from the wilderness of pack politics and ancient grudges. Below them, the fortress sprawled across the mountainside like a great stone beast, and beyond that, territories that stretched to the horizon acknowledged their rule. "Do you ever regret it?" Axel asked quietly. "What you've become? What we've built together?" Riley considered the question seriously, thinking of the broken Omega who had once begged for scraps of affection from a mate who saw her as disposable. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she might have known in a half-remembered dream. "Never," she said finally. That woman was weak. She let others define her worth, let them convince her that survival was the best she could hope for. This woman, your queen, Luna's mother, the ruler of half the supernatural world, she knows better. She turned in his arms, meeting his silver eyes with her own. I regret nothing. Not the pain that shaped me, not the violence that freed me, not the darkness we've embraced together. This is who I was always meant to be. I just needed the right monster to show me how. His kiss was possessive, claiming, absolute, everything their bond had always been. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, the space between them electric with power and desire and something that might have been love if either of them had still believed in gentle emotions. Together, he said, and it was both promise and threat. Forever, she agreed, her hand finding his and squeezing tight enough to bruise. Outside their window, the blood moon hung full and crimson in the star-drunk sky, casting everything in shades of silver and scarlet. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled their allegiance to the night and the power it represented. And in her cradle, Luna stirred and smiled in her sleep, already dreaming of the empire she would inherit, a realm built on shadows and silver fire, ruled by monsters who had learned that true love was measured not in gentleness but in the lengths one would go to protect what mattered most. The Beast King had found his perfect match. And together, they had rewritten the rules of what it meant to live happily ever after. Their story would be told for generations, whispered around pack fires and written in the margins of history books. Some would call it a cautionary tale about power corrupting even the purest hearts. Others would see it as proof that the right monster could save you, if you were brave enough to embrace the darkness they offered. But those who truly understood would recognize it for what it really was, a love story written in blood and starlight, the epic of two predators who found in each other not redemption, but completion. The Moon Queen and her Beast King, rulers of an empire built on the understanding that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become something the world will fear. And they lived ruthlessly ever after. The end. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe, like and share this video to continue listening to this type of story daily and also, to appreciate this community too. I would like to hear your wonderful opinion about this story. Please comment below.